Just a few days after Pope Francis's death, when Mark Ruffalo appeared on a late-night talk show, viewers were expecting a typical interview, a warm conversation, a touch of sadness, perhaps a smile as the actor mentioned a new project. But from the moment he stepped onto the stage, there was something off. The host tried to make the audience laugh, but Mark seemed to be in another world. He wasn't smiling. He acted as if someone else should be there. His eyes were fixed on a small golden rosary lying silently on the table in front of him. At that moment, the atmosphere changed. The questions took a different turn. So did the answers. What initially seemed like a routine segment quickly found a new path in a confession, an unexpected revelation, and a suppressed reality. This was no longer just a guest-filled night show. Mark Ruffalo had decided to share the burden he had been carrying with the audience, following a secret meeting at the Vatican. What they shared was profound enough to shake our beliefs about faith, power, and prophecy. Before continuing, write in the comments which role you like Mark Ruffalo in the most. At that moment, the studio lights flickered briefly and stabilized. The LED lights from the cameras reflected onto the faces of the audience members waiting in their seats. On any other night, it would have been just Hollywood gossip, movie anecdotes, and a few laughs. But this night was different. And it wasn't just because of the echoes of Pope Francis's death. The host announced with all his energy, "Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Ruffalo!" Applause erupted. Some audience members disregarded studio rules and pulled out their cell phones to record the moment. He was wearing a black suit, but no tie. His hair was a bit messy, and his face had a familiar yet thoughtful expression. His steps were steady, but it seemed as though his mind was still backstage. When Mark Ruffalo entered, the audience greeted him with applause. The host extended his hand, and Mark shook it with a slight smile. They sat down in their chairs. On the table was a glass of water, a few question cards, and a gold rosary resting on a striking dark blue velvet cushion. The host made a joke to lighten the mood. "Strange times, aren't they? The Pope has passed away, but you're still immortal. What's the secret? Holy water or something?" The audience chuckled, but Mark only twitched his lips. It wasn't a real smile. His eyes were fixed on the rosary. This wasn't just a casual glance. He was transfixed. He paused for a moment, then his expression began to change. The silence grew heavy. The audience sensed the change. The laughter stopped, and silence spread like a wave. "Is everything okay?" asked the host, a tense smile on his face. "You seem a little more withdrawn than usual tonight." Mark took a deep breath. He slowly reached out and touched the rosary with his fingertips. His eyes were distant, as if reliving a distant memory. "In Rome one night, someone told me something," he finally said. His voice was low, almost as if he were talking to himself. The host leaned forward slightly. The studio was silent. "And I think I need to tell you now," Mark said, without taking his eyes off the rosary on the table. The audience looked at each other in shock, some thinking it was all an act. But there was not the slightest trace of acting on Mark's face. This was not a character, this was the truth. The host tried to break the tension. "Mark, what are you going to tell us?" Mark looked at him. The answer was already there in the depths of his eyes. "What Pope Francis entrusted to me," he said quietly, "what he didn't want to take to the grave with him." Mark hadn't come there to promote a film or to receive applause. He took a deep breath and began to speak slowly. His voice was soft but filled with a sincere determination. "Years ago, I received an invitation that sounded unreal." The rosary was still on the table in front of him. He clasped his hands together, his eyes turned downward. "I was in Florence. We were shooting an independent European film. It was a low-budget, intimate project. That night, someone knocked on my hotel room door. A few audience members leaned forward involuntarily. He didn't say who he was. He just handed me an envelope with the Vatican seal and wax seal. He didn't even speak." The host narrowed his eyes in curiosity. "Was it official?" Mark shook his head. "No, neither diplomatic nor institutional. The note inside was entirely personal, handwritten. It was from Pope Francis himself." A faint murmur rose from the audience. The host asked in a low voice, "What did it say?" Mark paused for a moment, gazing into the distance, as if rereading the letter in his mind. Just one sentence. I would like to walk with you quietly among the olive trees. That was all. No cameras, no media, just a call and silence. That silence changed the atmosphere of the room. It was as if something sacred had been revealed. Did you go? The presenter asked, his voice almost a whisper. Mark did not hesitate. Yes, something inside me told me I needed to understand why he had made that invitation. Was he asking for help? For a donation? I didn't know, but what I found was much bigger than I had imagined. The room grew heavy. No one moved. They picked me up in a car at night and took me to the side entrance of the Vatican. It was cold. An old man was waiting for me at the gate. We walked through corridors like a labyrinth. Then we came out into the garden. Under an old tree, there he was. Mark's voice trembled. The Pope was very tired. His body was frail, but his eyes were the most alive thing I've ever seen. The host remained silent. Mark continued. He recognized me immediately. He started talking. He had seen a secret video, a silent visit I had made to a children's hospital. He said that silence said more than any sermon ever could. Mark took a deep breath, then he fixed his eyes on the rosary on the table. Then he told me a secret. When the Pope said he felt God had been silent for a long time, the studio went dead silent. I'm not saying his voice was loud, but what he said was heavy. It hit like a ton of bricks. Mark paused, choosing his words carefully. The weight of that chair, the Pope said to him, can be too much for a man to bear. To represent something, but to be alone, that was the most painful part for him. I prayed every night, the Pope said, but sometimes the heavens just remained silent. As Mark recounted this memory, he was no longer speaking to the host but directly to the audience. There was a sense of urgency and even fear in his eyes. Wait, the Pope had told him. Faith conquers silence, but one day, if silence begins to be imitated, then everything will collapse. The host asked in a whisper, So, what did you say? Mark replied, Nothing, really. I couldn't say anything. I just listened. Then he slowly reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out an envelope sealed with a red wax seal. He handled it carefully as if it were made of glass. If I never see you again, the Pope had said, this secret must remain hidden. A strange murmur filled the room. The host asked in a trembling voice, Did you open the envelope that night? Mark shook his head. No, I didn't even touch it for years. It wasn't my place while he was alive. But now he's gone. Even the buzz in the studio had faded away. It was as if the microphones had been turned off, as if time had stopped. Mark fixed his gaze on the golden rosary in front of him. This envelope, it was with me on every film set, in every hotel room. I never opened it because I never thought it belonged to me. But when I heard the news of his death, something inside me changed. He reached into his jacket again. Slowly, with great care, he took out the envelope. The wax seal was still intact. It bore the papal coat of arms. The air in the room grew heavy. The host held his breath. Are you going to open it now? He asked, his voice cracking. Mark didn't answer. He turned to the cameras and showed them the envelope. Then he broke the seal silently. The sound of the seal breaking was louder than anything that had been heard up to that point. Then, without his hands trembling, he took out the paper. He began to read, not for himself, but for everyone. The audience leaned forward as if drawn by an invisible magnet. There wasn't a single movement in the studio. Mark read the yellowish page he had taken out of the envelope. This world doesn't need more saints or gold, he began. It needs men who will carry the light, not those who hide in the shadows of those who are supposed to protect it. The paper in his hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what it carried. I write this with a heart caught between duty and despair, he continued. For years I fought behind marble walls. While wearing a fisherman's crown, I swam in a sea filled with secrets. Mark paused for a moment. He closed his eyes. He swallowed hard. Within this church, there are forces I can never cleanse. They wear crosses, but they move like wolves. The presenter opened his mouth to speak, but then stopped. He fixed his eyes on Mark. I tried to expose them, Mark said, his voice growing quieter. But I couldn't. He then looked away from the page. And now, if my voice is silenced, I leave this truth to you, not to destroy it, but to carry it like a rhythm. Because you are a free stranger, far removed from the political calculations of this world. The room was silent again. Only breathing could be heard. At the end of the letter, Mark said slowly, carefully opening the second page, there was something else. His eyes fell on the lines. His voice was almost a whisper. A vision, a prophecy. The presenter leaned forward slightly. Mark narrowed his eyes. The Pope wrote it. Then he took a deep breath. The one who will destroy me will not come from among us. He will not smile. He will appear as a friend, but carry emptiness within him. A murmur rose in the hall and some of the audience flinched. The presenter blinked. Mark continued. The Pope believed that the end of faith would not come from heresy, but from imitation. An empty but attractive face, a void coming under the mask of good intentions. Then silence fell. Time seemed to stand still. Mark stared into the distance. I didn't understand it then, he said. But after that letter, everything changed. The presenter whispered, What do you mean? Mark looked at him. I started working in silence, faith, strength, silence. What did they mean? I tried to figure it out. I didn't tell anyone. I just tried to understand. A brief pause. And then the letter started coming. The host asked almost fearfully, From whom? Mark was now looking directly into the camera. From people I didn't know. Anonymous letters, all connected to him, and all telling me never to speak of this. He clutched the second page tightly in both hands. His eyes bore a weight far deeper than the paper. He raised his head, his gaze sweeping across the room. Then he added quietly, I've never read this part out loud to anyone before. Even the crew behind the camera was motionless. It was as if everyone there was holding time itself. Mark looked at the second page in his hand once more, and he read slowly, The person who will destroy me will not come from within. He won't smile. He'll dress like a friend, but he'll carry emptiness inside. The sentence echoed through the studio like a stone being dropped. A faint murmur, like a breeze rustling through dry leaves, filled the air. The host sat motionless. His eyes were open, but even his breath seemed afraid to disturb the invisible spell. Mark carefully folded the letter and placed it next to the rosary on the table. The Pope's belief, said Mark, was that the real threat didn't come from within the church, but from outside, like a reflection, from an empty mirror. Someone who doesn't seem real, but whose charm can draw everyone in, and who will begin to rot from within. When the silence was broken, the host's voice was trembling. Did he think it had already begun? Mark shook his head slightly. He told me, the world's faith is no longer collapsing under the weight of reality. It is collapsing under the hunger for illusions. This sentence silenced everyone in the studio. The host shifted uneasily in his seat, glancing at the production crew. Maybe a commercial break. Maybe an interruption. But no one moved. Mark continued speaking. The Pope said that the next great step for faith may no longer be taken by the church itself. His words hung in the air. It was as if they had fallen out of a sacred text. The host tried to change the subject with a glimmer of hope. You're talking about some very big ideas here, Mark. Theology, power, prophecy. Maybe we should take a break? Mark's response was calm but firm. No. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable weight. This isn't a story, it's a warning. A brief pause. Then he added, and there's more. The host leaned back. His eyes searched but found no exit. Mark continued, After that meeting at the Vatican, I returned home. I didn't tell anyone, not even my closest friends. But exactly 1 year later, I received an envelope. He reached under the desk and pulled out a folder. He took out an old, yellowed piece of paper with curled edges. There was no return address, no signature. He held the paper. His eyes scanned the text line by line. Then he read aloud, Do not open the envelope. There are forces watching you. They are surrounding you. You are not one of them. Stay in the shadows. Silence will protect you more than you think. The host leaned forward, his eyes wide. This is clearly a threat. Mark nodded, yes, and this was only the first. He took a deep breath. Over the next 4 years, 6 more letters arrived, all from different places, all in different handwriting, but the contents were the same. Speak not, share not, remain silent. The host held his breath. Did you think these came from within the church? Mark paused for a moment. At first, yes. But over time, the pieces started to fit together, Mark said, slowly placing the first letter back on the table. At first, I thought it was just a few scary coincidences. But then patterns began to emerge. The sudden deaths of reformist priests, journalists investigating the Vatican's finances who then disappeared without a trace, and notes forgotten in the margins of old Bibles and locked archives, untouched by anyone. The host opened his mouth, but then immediately fell silent. He just listened. Mark continued. I found a name, he said, then he paused. As if to correct himself, he added, more accurately, a phrase. He turned to the camera. His eyes were now like a door opening onto another world. The S candidate. Something changed on the faces of the audience. They didn't know what it meant, but the word passed through them like a cold wind. It's Latin, Mark explained. It means nameless. This was not a group. It was not an organization, a belief. Formed by those who no longer trust the church but have not given up on God, a silent and invisible network. The presenter asked quietly, do you think the Pope trusted them? Mark shook his head slightly. No, he feared them. But perhaps he saw them as necessary, because the church, as we know it, did not have the power to face what was coming. Silence fell again in the room. Then Mark uttered the words that changed everything. That was when I realized the Pope hadn't chosen me at random. The host looked up. What do you mean? Mark's face didn't darken, but it sank under the weight of the past. He saw something in me, something I couldn't see, until that dream. He turned his gaze to the audience. It was as if he was looking each of them in the eye. Then he leaned forward and took another piece of paper from the folder. This one was newer than the others, but it was worn. This reached me a few weeks before the Pope died, Mark said quietly. There was no seal, no signature, just a folded note left under the door of my hotel room. He showed the paper. It was typed, old paper. Just a few sentences. He read aloud. He is surrounded. If you open the envelope, you will suffer the consequences. Silence protects more than you think. Some of the audience shifted in their seats. The host blinked, trying to hide his surprise. What were you supposed to understand? He asked. Mark took a deep breath. I didn't know at the time, but then the letters kept coming. Each one was different handwriting, different words, but they all carried the same message. Stay silent. Keep quiet. Don't tell anyone what you know. Be silent, Mark said, lowering his eyes. The host asked carefully, well, did you ever try to find out who sent them? Mark shook his head slowly. Of course I tried. I hired private investigators. I pulled every connection I had in Europe, but there was nothing. No fingerprints, no security camera footage. Whoever sent these letters, or whoever they were, knew exactly what they were doing. Then he pulled a thin, worn folder from beside his chair. He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, scribbled notes, and some photographs. He silently spread a few of them out on the table. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, he said, like I was looking for meaning in things that weren't there. The host said nothing. Mark continued. But then, I found this photo. He took an old photo with yellowed edges. This was Father Matteo. He was so young. He had bright eyes. He was running youth programs in Palermo. He was also openly criticizing corruption in the church's finances. Mark narrowed his eyes. He disappeared on his way to Rome. He showed one of the clippings in his hand, an Italian headline. Journalists found dead in the Tiber River. He was investigating links between shady companies in South America and the Vatican. 2 days ago, he published a major expose, but they called his death a suicide. The host was clearly uneasy. He was taking deep breaths, but avoiding eye contact. Mark didn't stop. This may seem like too much information, but it all adds up. He pulled another page from the folder. It was an old Bible page. There was a roughly drawn eye on the edge of the page. Below it were three words, "Es nomen vivid," without name lives. This is someone we don't know, or something, alive but nameless. His voice had grown even quieter. This note isn't in the catalogs, it's not digital. It's handwritten, scribbled in the margin of the Bible. I've looked at it over and over, Latin, symbols, everything. The host reached for his water glass but didn't drink. His throat was dry. The audience in the studio was still waiting in silence. Mark lowered his eyes and spoke slowly. And then, I noticed something even more disturbing. He paused. There was no hesitation in his voice, only a deep tremor. The Pope didn't just see potential in me. He saw the silence that those people represented in me. Someone who was excluded but noticed. Someone the church didn't expect. He closed the folder. He raised his head and looked at the host. He didn't choose me because I belonged to the church. On the contrary, because I didn't belong. The host remained silent for a moment. His eyes were fixed on Mark. What he saw was no longer just an actor. At that moment, something had shifted in the studio. Finally, the host asked, his voice soft but filled with genuine curiosity, "But why you, Mark?" Mark leaned back. His eyes were distant, as if searching for something in the hazy mirror of the past. "Because of what happened after that dream." The host furrowed his brows. "The thing you're talking about." Mark slowly lowered his head. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible. "The night I opened the envelope, I had a dream. Maybe it was more than a dream." He turned to the audience. His eyes were no longer those of an actor, but of a witness. I was in a huge, abandoned basilica. Everything was covered in dust. No candles were burning, no prayers were being said. Only boys, silence, a deep, echoing silence. A shiver ran through the audience. Mark continued. Then, he was standing before the altar. Pope Francis. But he was different. Not weak or tired. Calm, as if he were radiating light. The host whispered, "What did he say?" Mark closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. He spoke each word slowly. "You thought you were just an actor," he said. "But I saw the man who carried silence with honor." A soft sigh filled the studio, a silence mixed with admiration. Mark continued, "I woke up, I was shaking, I was drenched in sweat. I never felt that way again." A pause. "After that day, I was never the same person again." The host looked at Mark, his voice almost breaking. "Do you think he knew he was going to die?" Mark didn't answer right away. Finally, in a very low voice, he whispered, "He wasn't afraid of death, but he was afraid of dying for nothing." Yes, he was afraid of that. Those words cut through the studio like a knife. A heaviness settled over the room. Mark turned back to the desk. He carefully pulled something else out of the folder. His fingers weren't trembling, but he moved with a noticeable care. "And that's why," he said, "I'm here tonight on live TV, because I'm going to show you something that shouldn't be seen." The silence deepened again. The host didn't speak. The audience didn't move. The man on stage was no longer just a guest. In that moment, he was the bearer of something greater. Mark took a deep breath. He placed his hands on the table. That dream was unlike anything I've ever experienced before. It wasn't like a fantasy. It was more like a vision that had been given to me. His eyes were determined but tired. I was in a huge church. It was empty, but it was sacred. Dust particles danced in the light, and every step I took echoed back. It was as if the ground itself was speaking. He paused. His voice was steady, but almost a whisper. Pope Francis was waiting at the altar, but this time he was different. He was surrounded by light. It was as if he wasn't dead, but transformed. The presenter leaned forward for a moment. He was completely focused. What did he say? Mark turned his eyes to the audience. It was as if he was addressing each one of them individually. "You," said the Pope in the dream, "thought you were just playing the part of a faithful man, but you were always more than that. You carry silence like a cloak, and you carry it with honor." Mark paused. His eyes seemed slightly moist. The church is drowning in its own echoes, the Pope had said. God's voice has been buried under the noise for centuries. Only one who understands the value of silence can hear it again. The host swallowed, averting his eyes. Then he whispered, "Do you really believe he was Pope Francis?" Mark paused for a long time before answering. "I don't know, but I believe this. It changed me." His voice grew soft. "Since that day, I've stopped working so hard. I now spend my days reading sacred texts, ancient manuscripts, mystical interpretations, apocryphal writings." He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, worn notebook. "I started writing every night. Thoughts, symbols, questions. Sometimes when I write, it feels like my hand isn't mine." The host was visibly shaken. "So, are you afraid?" he asked. Mark was silent for a long time. "I used to be very afraid," he said finally, "but maybe fear was just the first test." He turned to the rosary on the table and touched it gently with his fingertips. "Papa told me something else in my dream." The host waited. "Glens will be a door," Papa had said, "but will you let others pass through that door, or will you keep it closed forever? The choice is yours." There was a long silence. The host looked around. Everyone held their breath. "I wasn't expecting this when I sat down tonight," said the host. Mark smiled for the first time in minutes, but it was a tired smile. "When I took my first step into the Vatican, I wasn't expecting this either." "Why now?" asked the host. "Why on live TV?" Mark turned to the camera. His eyes were determined. "Because the truth is quieter than lies. And if I don't say it now, I may never get the chance again." He leaned back. He took a deep breath. "And there's something I need to show you," he said, turning toward the host. "Is it dangerous?" Mark lowered his eyes. "Maybe," he said. "But what scares me more is what will happen if I don't." He pulled a small, rectangular object from the folder. His fingers were trembling, but not from fear, from the weight of it. The host leaned forward slowly. "What is this?" Mark held it upside down. "A photograph from that night at the Vatican, taken secretly by someone." The audience was silent. "Me, the Pope, and we were in the garden." He turned the photograph, then he paused. "But in the background, there's someone else." The host's voice trembled. "What do you mean?" Mark looked at the photograph. "Behind the trees, a hooded silhouette, it's barely visible." He placed the photo on the table but didn't show it to the camera. "This figure has been in the other 3 photos I've received over the years, each time in a different place, but always at the same distance. He was always watching." The host almost whispered, "Who is this?" Mark looked up. "I don't know." The silence grew heavy. "But Papa warned me in my dream, before you see the light, you will see the shadow," he said. Mark placed the photo on the table, out of the camera's view. "This is us, me and Papa. It was taken the night we walked in the garden. Years later, it came into my possession anonymously. I didn't even know it existed." He pointed to the corner of the photo. "Look closely among the trees. That hooded figure is there. And it's in the other 3 photos too, always in different places, but always watching." Mark laid out the other photos. He held them out of the camera's reach. "The last words the Pope said to me were, 'You will see the shadow before you see the light.'" Silence fell again. "This isn't a threat," Mark said. "It's a warning. Something is coming, and it won't be the church that faces it. It will be us." He stood up. He was about to leave. "Faith isn't dead, it's waiting, but silence doesn't always mean peace." He took a step forward. He stood in front of the curtain. He turned around. "Sometimes, silence is where the war begins." Then a pause. He turned to the audience. "And if you think this is over, wait, because what comes next is worse."